In the kitchen at 12, Grimmauld Place, Molly Weasley fussed over a buffet of food which she had already spent all that afternoon over, pacing before it, straightening out imaginary creases from the already plain tablecloth and readjusting plates of sandwiches with a worried expression on her face. "Don't worry, Molly. It looks lovely," declared Tonks, striding into the kitchen and scrutinizing the plates and dishes, peering curiously at a multicolored layered jelly that towered over the artistic culinary display. "Getting quite full out there," she added, reaching towards a plate of brandy snaps which Mrs. Weasley took out of her reach just before Tonks knocked over a tower of Jaffa cakes. "Good," nodded Molly, ignoring Tonks's defeated expression. "I hope it's a full house. I doubt any of us want to miss what Dumbledore's got to say to us. It's been such a long time in coming." Turning, she picked up a small copper pan which had been hovering 6 inches over the old stove and clicked her fingers at the wooden spoon which had been hitherto stirring its contents slowly before pouring the thick custard-like substance over a steam pudding. "I wonder what he's going to say," mused Tonks, as the noise of wizards operating, greeting one another, shuffling and walking between the hall of the large magical terraced house in the north of London to the living room and clapping each other on the back as they broke into conversation and exchanging information echoed through to the kitchen. Almost 2 months since the last official order meeting, in the Great Hall of Hogwarts Castle after the Great Battle, and an anticipatory atmosphere was beginning to build. "I doubt it's going to be good," replied Molly, pursing her lips as she analyzed the spread of food again, moving a few plates so they were more symmetrical at the back of the table. "There's the Ministry and Fudge's interference," she continued as Tonks raised her eyebrows through the fringe of her bubble-gum pink bob. "All the work they're doing to try to catch you-know-who," she added, and Tonks nodded in agreement. "They do seem to be milking it for all it's worth," conceded Tonks, considering the plate of jam tarts near her left elbow. "I mean, everything the order sent to them they've analyzed and delved into." She shook her pink head in disbelief. "Well, we won't have to wait too long to find out now," said Molly, as Minerva McGonagall's statuesque figure appeared in the doorway, and she smiled at the elderly witch who took a few steps inside the kitchen in acknowledgement, looking approvingly at the food that Molly Weasley had made her labor of love that day. "Looks beautiful, Molly," she nodded, smiling warmly at Tonks who, elbows still on the large oak table, was resting her chin on her hands in a bored manner. "Tonks," she nodded, and the young witch smiled back at her. "I've been trying to tell her that all evening, Minerva, but she still keeps on fussing," muttered Tonks, sitting upright as the French fancies caught her eye, ignoring Molly Weasley's tut of exasperation. "And we won't all be here tonight," she added, getting to her feet and following Minerva McGonagall's silent gesture, indicating that her presence was required in the living room. "We're having the meeting in the living room tonight, Molly, starting in about 15 minutes' time." Minerva waited until Mrs. Weasley nodded before sweeping out of the kitchen and into the living room, Tonks in her wake. Closing the door behind her, Minerva McGonagall ushered Tonks through throngs of order wizards and to the back of the living room, close to the large phonograph, last used at the infamous Christmas ball, before sitting on the smallest of the 4 plush purple settees, also acquired at Christmas and as yet unreturned. Tonks sat next to her, expectantly. "We have everyone here tonight, Nymphadora, with the exception of one." Ignoring the use of her first name, Tonks scanned the groups of wizards and witches, grouped in 2s and 3s. There was Arthur Weasley and Sturgis Podmore chatting to Elphire Stoad and Elspeth Banks, Kingsley Shacklebolt and Bertie Griffin watching enthralled with the demonstration that Charlie Weasley was giving again to a fisherman proud of his recent catch, her cousin Sirius making casual conversation by the fireplace with Bathsheba Bradel. "Remus," gasped Tonks quickly, looking back at Minerva, wide-eyed before glancing down, embarrassed at her own admission of recognizing Remus Lupin's time of the month. "Perhaps," agreed Minerva, nodding at Tonks, before looking back out at the group of wizards, whose number now included Remus, his hand on the door handle, peering into the living room. On catching Tunks's eye he smiled, and she returned it before looking back at McGonagall. Cecilia, she nodded, realizing that she was not with him, and then her eyes grew wider in further anticipation. Then what she said was true. Minerva, glancing back out at the sea of wizards, as Sirius broke off his conversation with Bathsheba before pacing over the thin, ragged carpet towards his friend, engaging him in a brief exchange, clapping him on the back in apparent delight. "In that case 2 Order members are absent this evening," clarified the witch. "This evening, for the first time in the history of the Order of the Phoenix, I will be chairing the meeting. Dumbledore has regrettably informed me half an hour ago that he would be unavoidably detained at the Ministry upon a matter which concerns us entirely." Tunks watched the elderly witch push up her spectacles by the bridge, fixing her with a severe stare. "It is the discussion to which you were privy, albeit illegitimately 2 days ago, which Dumbledore wishes to become common knowledge amongst us tonight." Tunks shifted on the plush, expensive, and contraband settee, frowning at Minerva. "The significance of this you will understand, Nymphadora, tonight," McGonagall added cryptically, "for, while the content of tonight's meeting is important, the fact that it is being held at all, and the future of the Order is also at stake." While Minerva spoke to Tunks, the final few wizards made their arrival, including Snape, who sidled through the hall to living room door, standing conspicuously by the staircase, folding his arms and surveying the wizards coldly and stroking his left forearm absently. "Evening, Severus," greeted Bill Weasley, noticing the austere, grave stature of the tall wizard, ex-Death Eater, professor of potions at Hogwarts and part-time scientific researcher, and acknowledging him warmly. "How's things?" "Fine," intoned Snape coldly. "All fine," he added, nodding in Sirius's direction. "Sirius," he added, following Sirius Black's passage across the carpet. "How are you?" "Very well, Severus," he replied, holding out a hand. Snape took it, shaking it politely. Many of the Order stopped their conversation automatically at this extraordinary sign, although an uneasy truce had taken place following the Great Battle and subsequently through their revival of Cecilia with Snape's experimental remedy. Astonishment was still the default response at such a gesture, considering their hitherto volatile history. Good," nodded Snape, glancing past Sirius and at Remus. Sirius followed his gaze, watching as his friend approached them. "And yourself, Remus," nodded Snape again, the apparent politeness absent in his expression and tone of voice, and Remus inclined his head politely. "Thanks to you," he added as Sirius gave him a sideways glance. "Cecilia gave me the Wolfsbane potion. She is well, as you know," he added knowingly. Snape curled his lip but said nothing as Remus delved into his robe. "She asked me to pass this on to you," he added, giving Snape the letter that Cecilia had left in the kitchen for him to take that evening, and the wizard took it, staring at his own name written neatly in Cecilia's handwriting. "Something to do with the research," Remus added, as Snape continued to stare at it. "Her work has been invaluable, as always," replied Snape, as he hastily stowed it inside his robe, glancing at Remus, "though her location so far from Hogwarts has slowed the rate at which we are proceeding." He broke off as he watched a flick across Remus's face. "I trust she is well? And coping in a wizard household?" he added tenuously. "Yes, Severus, she is." "And your concern about her domestic arrangements are—" Remus broke off when he realized Sirius was looking about them. Others of the Order had inched their way into the conversation. Mr. Weasley smiled at Remus when he turned and looked at him. "Good to see you, Remus," he said heartily, smiling at him and Sirius. "Am I to understand that you are under the influence, that you managed to make the meeting at this time of the month?" Remus nodded, looking between him and Snape. "And Cecilia?" Remus nodded again, flicking his eyes across to Snape momentarily. "She is well, Arthur," he nodded. "Likes to do things her way." She even got grandmother's old stove working. Won't let me do anything by magic if she can do it the Mole way. He nodded towards Mr. Weasley, who grinned at Remus, his eyes lighting up with excitement. If it were me, I would insist, commented Sirius, absently. Well, you can take the Mole out of her world, but can't take the Mole out of her, he laughed. The others, with the exception of Snape, laughed too. Indeed, Arthur. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to find when I get home. Turning, he noticed Sirius's wry smile. Yes, agreed Tonks, who had appeared at Sirius's right. Moles can be a bit strange in the wizard world at first. Evening, Remus, she smiled. It was ace seeing you both last week. Nick appreciated it too, she added animatedly. So the cottage up there is secure, Tonks? Asked Sturgis, stepping over to join them. I know Dumbledore went out there with you, Remus, he added hastily, sensing Remus's defensiveness. Great, agreed Tonks. Even inapproachable and influable unless you know the secret password, she added with a grin. Nick had never flued before. Remus made a sidelong glance at Snape. But we see she's not with you tonight, Remus, pressed Kingsley Shacklebolt, his large frame towering next to Arthur Weasley. Too overwhelming? Remus shook his head. She's got her mind caught up in her work, as usual, he replied, smiling at Kingsley. Far better for her to be there, being productive than here tonight, with whatever's going on. Remus took a step back, smiling at all of the wizards who had gathered around them, catching Minerva McGonagall's meaningful gaze as she stepped before them. 88,888,888. McGonagall stood before the Order of the Phoenix, not quite her usual steadfast self. Oh, she could stand before her pupils at Hogwarts well enough, when she was teaching Transfiguration, disciplining, presiding over detentions, encouraging on the Quidditch pitch. And it wasn't as if she hadn't stood before nearly all of them in this stead before, yet standing in front of over 24 expectant faces, waiting to receive and share information, obtain instructions and look to the head of the order, the task seemed overwhelming. However, this evening, the head of the order had been unavoidably detained, caught up in the predicament that Minerva had promised Dumbledore she would divulge to the order, in its horrifying gravity. She must facilitate its discussion and come to a satisfying conclusion all within the space of an hour with wizards with significant vested interests. All things considered, thought Minerva as she surveyed the order members, she would have felt happier igniting a basketful of dragon eggs at close range. Surveying the wizards, who were lined up neatly in rows, she tried her best to smile and summoned some courage before a voice in the back of her head kicked her cerebellum into action. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, she began, folding her hands neatly in front of her. I would like to say first of all that it is with regret that Dumbledore cannot be with us this evening. He has asked me to chair the order meeting. At this, there were various low mumbles from the order as the wizards muttered amongst themselves and Minerva pressed on, ignoring them. There are a number of things to discuss and agree on, the first being the enemy. We know, from various reports following the great battle, that Voldemort has been weakened beyond anything we could have hoped. Through the perseverance of one of our members, here Minerva glanced approvingly in the direction of Remus, he was almost defeated. However, he has not gone. And from past history we know he has recovered before, from the brink of death. Yes, Severus? McGonagall acknowledged Snape's raised hand. We know why he wasn't defeated, or at least have a theory. Snape's voice rang out in the stillness that Minerva's announcement had induced, and the order wizards looked at him silently. McGonagall nodded in confirmation. Yes, Severus, we will come to that. But first, an announcement. Dumbledore feels it is right to honor Cecilia for her work in science and magic, for her work on the Universal Link. At her announcement there was a round of applause and she waited until it had died down, in the hope that one day it will be recognized officially. The applause began to start up again, but died away as Remus Lupin got to his feet, smiling and nodding politely. "On her behalf I thank you," he began, his voice soft and his lined face placid. Cecilia in her wisdom anticipated something of this nature. He smiled at the wizards and witches before looking back at Minerva. "Perhaps something mentioned in the minutes?" he suggested, glancing at Arthur Weasley, and a good-natured murmur began to ripple through the order. "How is she, Remus?" asked one wizard, at the front. "Is she well?" asked another, Doris Crockwood, a small wizened witch near the front, one of who had originally objected to Cecilia's accession into the order. "She is perfectly fine," nodded Remus happily. "Thank you for asking." "And the date of your wedding?" asked Bill, grinning widely at the back. Molly Weasley nudged him urgently, glancing at Tunks. "Is a matter for another time," cut in Minerva before glancing at Remus. "Quite right," he agreed, smiling at McGonagall. "Please continue, Minerva." He sat back down and turned to Sirius, who was also grinning. "She doesn't want gold, or anything then?" he asked as McGonagall continued to read the lengthy list of items on the agenda for the evening's meeting. "Not even a nice trip back to Hogwarts?" Remus gave him a stern look, catching Snape's igneous stare penetrating the side of his head as he pretended to concentrate on what McGonagall was saying. He couldn't blame his friend. He knew Sirius of old and anticipated this attitude. But even so, when it came down to it, he knew Sirius supported his relationship with Cecilia even if he did try to provoke low-level conflict. Tonight he would show his friend just how much he still needed him, for that's where Sirius's motive came, he knew. Banishing the uncomfortable thoughts of the forthcoming evening to the back of his mind, Remus concentrated his thoughts on the reports from the Ministry that each member who worked there was giving. Passing a bill to prevent moles coming to Diagon Alley or other wizarding locations at all. Sturgis Podmore was on his feet, as he had been for the last 10 minutes, briefing the order with a summary of news. It would seem that rather than the order's information being beneficial to the Ministry, a sort of low-level panic was beginning to set in as more and more legislation was being brought in to heighten wizard security. "They say it is to do with security, though I can't see how," he added, wrinkling his nose so that his tooth-bristle moustache wriggled, as if it were alive. "They are allowing access to those with existing mole permits, but refusing to renew any." "Panic, that's all it is," declared Moody, shaking his walking stick in protest. "The Ministry can't tell their ass from their elbow, present company accepted," he added, his dynamic eye swirling in its socket. "They just don't want to admit that they've been wrong all these years," he growled, menacingly. "Personally, I have to agree," said Minerva, stepping back in front of the wizards again as Alastor Moody settled himself down grudgingly in his chair. "Which brings me back to our meeting here." She surveyed the wizards again, looking at each one in turn. The Ministry's involvement in the Great Battle was intended to be its first and last contact with the Order of the Phoenix. At the battle, Voldemort was supposed to be defeated and the existence of our organization terminated because our work was finally done. Minerva exhaled. However, Voldemort was not defeated, and as a result, our existence as a secret organization is under threat through the knowledge the Ministry has procured. Currently Dumbledore is at the Ministry " "So that's what Umbridge meant!" exclaimed Tonks, elated, and Minerva nodded. "Indeed, Dumbledore has been at the Ministry for the last 3 days trying to smooth over and sort out the situation. Back in March they agreed in principle that our existence was a good thing in retrospect." At this there was a room full of spontaneous applause. However, Minerva continued, caution in her voice, "there are a number of things that they are not happy with in the paperwork that was sent to the Ministry, one being our existence." At this, there was a resounding boo. And another, she looked across at Tunks. Tonks, perhaps you would be good enough to share with us what exactly you did over here the other day? At this, the young witch, her candy pink hair growing brighter and more vivid, got to her feet. A few days ago I happened to be down in the lower floors of the ministry, she clarified, as she looked upon some puzzled faces. A couple of people were talking, just beyond my hearing, but I caught a few words that sounded like mole studies. Getting into her stride, Tonks stepped forward, onto Charlie Weasley's foot, and she quickly mouthed an apology before continuing. The Undersecretary to Fudge, Dolores Umbridge, was speaking to someone about Hogwarts, saying that Dumbledore was foolish to set mole studies as an exam subject and even more foolish to allow a mole to teach it. She grinned at the wizards, who began to speak amongst themselves again. That's what they would say. Total rubbish. Well, said Tonks loudly, endeavoring to maintain quiet so she could continue with the story. The person she was speaking to asked what was going to happen now, and surely that wouldn't continue. Umbridge replied that under Dumbledore anything was possible, but the curriculum at Hogwarts may not be under his control for much longer. Tonks sat down on her chair, at the back of the living room, while the wizards began to talk loudly and freely amongst themselves, turning to one another as they talked. Tonks and Minerva exchanged looks as the discussion grew around them. Well, seeing as Dumbledore has set mole studies as an exam subject, then either Dumbledore or the Ministry must find someone to replace her if Mrs. Frobisher doesn't return. Mrs. Weasley, stepping determinedly before Minerva, spoke above the wizards, folding her arms. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. Cecilia I meant," she added, turning to Lupin and giving him an apologetic look. "Has she decided to return? Summer term's only a few days away, and we really ought to know who will be teaching, especially if they are to take their OWLs." Molly wrung her hands anxiously as Remus turned to her, smiling. "She does wish to return." It wasn't Remus who spoke this time. Snape was on his feet and speaking to Molly. "She wishes to return to finish the potion." His words fell like slabs of granite onto basalt, and he glared at the wizards from his place near the fireplace in the living room, his eyes resting on Remus again momentarily before looking at Molly. The room was as one, was now silent, waiting for the next move, so still as if everyone present was holding their breath. Then Remus got to his feet. "She does," he sighed wearily, conceding the point to Snape. "But not until September at the very least. And in the meantime, it would be in her interests, and ours, were she to return to Hogwarts, that would take the Ministry out of the equation." Remus turned sharply and realized that it was Sirius who was speaking now. "How is the work proceeding, Severus?" asked Minerva, diverting the attention of the Order from the silent exchange taking place between the two old friends. "Can you estimate the length of time until the potion is ready?" Snape looked from Sirius and Remus and back to Minerva, nodding slowly. "The work is at a critical stage." He folded his arms and took 2 large strides towards the front of the meeting, standing to McGonagall's right, and surveyed the wizards and witches malevolently. "How strange it is that, a few months ago, when we stood here contemplating the fate of Mrs. Frobisher, contemplating the validity of the work, that the first item in our meeting is our unanimous decision to honor her. However, her incarceration from any society, whether wizard or mole, has not prevented her from making invaluable advances over the last few months." He glanced at Remus Lupin, who was half out of his chair. "Not now," hissed Sirius, pulling him back down. Harry made a full recovery and appears unharmed," Snape continued, ignoring Remus. "From the original we have a crudely tuned potion which, when it has been fully developed and attuned, will be fit for purpose. However, as we do not know when it will be required, we need to work quickly as well as accurately. Mrs. Frobisher's disadvantageous proximity may be more than a disadvantage should an attack come quickly." "Thank you, Severus," said Minerva, stepping forward into the space Snape vacated and watched with the others as he strode back to his seat, and she swallowed, the unease of her next announcement dwelling in her chest. What she had to say would make Snape's inflammatory report sound positively charming. Sadly, this is not an option for more than one reason, she continued, the focus from the Order now back on her. Following the reports made at the time of the Great Battle, they were sent for filing by the Aurors of the Ministry. So many were the reports and so detailed, the Cornelius Fudge chose to distribute the work amongst the entire staff, sectioning off the work into departments. Breaking off, she saw the wizards and witches who worked at the Ministry. Mr. Weasley, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Tonks, Sturgis Podmore, Bathsheba, look at one another and nod. Yes, Sturgis. She nodded at Podmore, who had raised a hand. The Ministry are aware of our existence. He stood up and spoke plainly, his moustache bobbing up and down as he spoke. They always have been. Around him, others continued to nod in agreement. Yes, they knew before, replied Minerva. They knew Dumbledore had a secret society. But officially, they knew of the existence of the Order of the Phoenix, but nothing else. The wizards present at the Great Battle, each had a good reason to be there, so I suggest that each and every one of you have a foolproof reason should anyone come asking. Around the room, a murmuring began to arise and the gravity of the situation began to dwell on Minerva. Dumbledore should be doing this, Minerva thought. This is dreadful, I can give no reassurances, Albus. They need you, not me for this. Looking round at the wizards in turn, those who had been with them the first time round, those risking discovery or danger, those losing heart underneath the smiles and the optimism. So what is the Ministry's full knowledge? Elspeth Banks raised her hand, her shrill voice bouncing through the air as she nodded her head, her errant curls bobbing in time with her voice. Kingsley? Minerva turned to Kingsley Shacklebolt, sitting near the back on her left. You are the most senior Ministry employee, perhaps you are the best to field this question? To her relief, the large black wizard nodded his head. Certainly, Minerva, he intoned, his face stern as he rose to his full height. The situation is much as you have heard, he continued, his rich resonant voice filling number 12 Grimmauld Place's living room. The Ministry are aware of a secret group led by Dumbledore who were present on the evening of the Great Battle. They are suspicious of our members, however certain leniency that was once granted to Dumbledore has been removed in light of the security measures that have been put in place. He glanced around the wizards before continuing. What Minerva is trying to say, if I may be so bold, McGonagall nodded slightly, is that because the head department ministers have agreed that the main priority is to maintain security for wizards, this includes the task of discovering the exact nature of the Order, securing the wizard world from knowledge by moles, and to tighten wizard security at the Ministry and homes. All knowing moles of a year or more are allowed to keep their permits, which they must carry, at all time. Those of less than a year will be befuddled. This includes the parents of Mulborns at Hogwarts, he added, nodding in confirmation at the many startled looks he was getting. It's true, they are the busiest department, interjected Bathsheba, nodding sadly. Well, this is dreadful, exclaimed Agnatia Bouts, the proprietress of Bouts the Apothecary in Diagon. The Ministry are interfering. It's worse than that. They seem to be very doing it by the book, replied Tonks. Arthur and Kingsley nodded in agreement. And I think we've got worse to come. You should see the decrees that are coming in, continued Arthur, reaching up to the quill that he was enchanting to take the minutes of that evening's meeting and smoothing its feathers agitatedly. The paperwork and things we have to do. Fudge isn't taking any chances after looking stupid about Voldemort before. Interfering, declared Agnatia, banging her gnarled walking stick on the thick Persian carpet. Well, we did call them in, replied Elspeth, turning to Agnatia. Well, Dumbledore did. We couldn't have done it without them. That's debatable," scoffed Sirius, folding his arms. "All this was supposed to be over anyway, from what you said, Minerva," he added, looking at McGonagall. "When they found out about us we wouldn't be meeting, it would have been an academic exercise." He broke off when he saw her glance quickly at Remus before returning her stare to Shacklebolt, and he followed it, frowning. "In addition," continued Kingsley to the Order as they turned to him too, "the Ministry aimed to discover the meaning of the universal link which was mentioned in one report." He returned the discourse to Minerva, like verbal table tennis. "Dumbledore has a few questions to answer about all of this, in particular of the wizard enemy number 1. Who poses the highest security risk? The most wanted mole, Cecilia Frobisher." At Minerva's words the murmuring amongst the wizards stopped again, every one of them becoming inanimate and struck dumb. "I've done it now, Albus," she thought. "I've gone too far. You'd have known when to stop." Just then, the silence was punctuated by laughter. Remus had broken into a grin, which had developed into mirth. She would be very proud of that. He chuckled, beaming. "So, she's safe and secure she is, Remus dear?" Molly Weasley was out of her seat again, and approached Remus, her face a mask of concern, and she held his arm urgently. "No one other than us knows where she is?" "She doesn't go out much, Molly," he replied calmly. "And only those who know the secret password can gain access." "Even so, Mrs. Frobisher is not a prisoner," added Sirius as he caught Snape's ashen expression. "She's well hidden." "Dumbledore did most of the charms himself," said Remus quietly. At this, Molly let out a sigh, retiring to her seat and holding her husband's arm in an outward show of relief. "What of her family, Minerva?" Mr. Weasley held his hand aloft and continued to charm the quill into writing the meeting's minutes on the thick parchment binding, glancing at her before looking at the witch who had raised her hand. "Bathsheba? I go there 3 times a week. Mrs. Wells, Miss Wells and the child believe they always lived in that house in Aberdeen and that the girl is Cecilia's sister's child." She nodded about the wizards as she spoke, her voice and tenor quick and urgent, "Going about mole business, from what I can tell." "But she could still technically come back to teach," said Arthur. "Dumbledore has jurisdiction at Hogwarts." "For how long?" "It would be rather foolish of him to do so," replied Shacklebolt, giving Arthur a knowing look, and he nodded. As he did so a look passed between Minerva and Snape. "Then I need to inform you this: the reason for Dumbledore not being here. Tonight he is at the Ministry for questioning regarding the circumstances surrounding the Great Battle. He is there under his own volition. Tomorrow—" She broke off, glancing at Kingsley before fixing the group of students under her gaze, preparing to give them bad news. Detention. No supper. No Quidditch. Tomorrow he will be taken under full guard to face the Wizengamot. Minerva held her face firm as the gasps from all assembled broke into exclamations of disgust and alarm, horror and disbelief. Above the cacophonous commotion, Remus's voice rang clear. "On what grounds, Minerva?" Like many of them, he was also on his feet, but the look on his face was one of grave concern rather than outrage. "High wizardly reason. For presiding over a subversive group and for engaging in mole-wizard relations. Being a reciprocator," she qualified. "What of Voldemort?" "As we are aware," replied Kingsley, still on his feet, "the majority of the Death Eaters are at Azkaban and the rest are sought by the Ministry-errors. And the Order?" The silence that followed was broken only by this single question. Though voiced by Molly Weasley, it echoed the feelings of all. "As yet, unclear. We shall endeavor to assist, as we have always done indirectly, with fighting Lord Voldemort and the remaining Death Eaters still at large. However, our present organization may soon be out of the question." Minerva stopped as the uncertain air permeated even her own mind. "Stop talking now," she told herself sharply. "But we will continue to do it, won't we?" Tunks's voice spoke tentatively, her voice cut with concern. "No one knows, love," replied Mrs. Weasley soothingly. "In that case," continued McGonagall, "as we are still not sure of the future, we should continue our meeting as we have always done. May we start with the reports from Azkaban?" 88,888,888. The meeting concluded very abruptly with the reports from the Arashifts, having gone through the usual procedure of sharing the information they knew. It had taken almost 2 hours and most of the wizards and witches had something to contribute. But Minerva could see that there was nothing else in many of their heads than what she had just broken to them. She couldn't blame them, she had been shaken herself when she had received the owl from him that afternoon. All she could do, all any of them could do, was to trust Dumbledore. At least now, she thought, looking around, the wizards, who had broken up into their informal groups again, were chatting amongst themselves, and Minerva was heartened that most of them had remained behind to be ushered into the kitchen by Molly as she fussed over the sandwiches and cakes that had been her labor of love, although a few had taken their leave straight away. She watched from her place near the door to the kitchen as Remus and Sirius took a few sandwiches each, chatting to one another by the fireplace. "What do you think's going to happen tomorrow?" "With Dumbledore?" asked Sirius, patting Remus on the arm as he glanced around the living room. Most of the conversations around them, though informal, contained snippets of Dumbledore's treason charge and implications of it on the future. "It'll be fine," Remus replied, looking down at the worn stair carpet. "He'll be fine." He felt his friend's hand on his shoulder and looked at him. "Full moon tonight," he replied, answering Sirius's silent question, and he nodded in understanding. Remus took a step back and uncurled his clenched fist. "I've got the potion." He looked at Sirius, hoping he could convey what he was feeling without having to explain. Just then Sirius looked past him and Remus turned to see Minerva standing behind him, and glowering behind her Snape. "Good night," she said, smiling at Remus. "We're about to leave. It's been wonderful to see you." Looking down, she made to shake his hand, but instead she looked at his open palm, smiling a little before looking at Sirius. "Thank you," she repeated. "Give my regards to Cecilia," said Snape, looking at Remus before stepping into the hearth. Remus's expression changed, but Sirius held his friend's arm. "Yes," nodded Minerva warmly. "I'm happy for you both," she added before stepping next to Snape. Within seconds both of them had departed by Floo. Remus watched as the hearth glow dimmed to nothing, his mind blank until he heard Sirius's voice by his ear. "So am I," said Sirius, softly. Remus turned and looked into his friend's eyes. "Just thought I'd say. I don't think I've said that before," he smiled. "So, I suppose with that potion, you won't want Mr. Snuffles tonight," he continued as they made their way past ever-dwindling groups of wizards and witches, still chatting and laughing amongst themselves, the bombshell of the evening being slowly replaced by easy familiarity. "It'll be the fire in your cottage tonight, with a pair of warm hands caressing you." Remus turned to Sirius, noting the disappointment in his friend's tone as he tried to sound casual. "You'd better not, Padfoot. There's no way Cecilia'd approve of that." "No," he smiled, holding open the kitchen door, nodding at Molly, who had broken off her animated conversation with Tunks as they made their way in. "On the contrary. Tonight's a lunar eclipse. I'm going to need you more than ever tonight.